Hello, welcome back to another episode of History Hack. Don't forget to leave us a nice 5-star review on Apple. Remember, you can type in along the lines of, I want a lock of Chris's sexy ginger hair. Remember, we also have a new website on www.historyhack.co.uk, or you can buy us a drink on Ko-fi. You know, like I said, I need to fund my plant habit, Chris needs to fund his Coke habit, and Alex, God knows what she needs to fund at the moment, but lots of things. You can buy it on ko-fi.com/historyhack. That's just a one-off donation. Or you can subscribe if you want to be a really, really loyal patron of ours. You can subscribe to our Patreon, which is www.patreon.com/historyhack. Like I mentioned, you know, you still can get a lock of Chris's gorgeous ginger hair, and that is what is left of it. Anyway, moving on to our episode today, we are joined by Catharine Williams, who is talking to us about early modern colonialism. Hi, Catharine.
Hi there.
You are all the way in the US and you still have daylight, so I'm really, really jealous right now.
Yeah, I'm soaking in that daylight.
Do you know what? Soon it'll be summer. Just a few more months and then we will have the summer and it'll be good. But anyway, listen, enough of me chit-chatting, because I do that occasionally. We're going to talk about early modern colonialism, which for me is I'm a little bit in the dark here, so you might have to educate me.
Of course.
So we're going to talk about some of the main players in medieval and early modern Europe. Tell us a bit about those.
So, a main player in both medieval and early modern Europe is the Pope. In the Middle Ages, the Pope was effectively the king of all kings, and kings answered to the Pope, and if kings had an issue with one another, they took it to the Pope. In the early modern era, with the rise of nation states, kings were less incentivized to answer exclusively to the Pope, and they started answering more and more to their own people to various extents. So even if kings stopped answering to the Pope, they still turned to the Pope if they had a problem with one another. For instance, the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, Portugal and Spain had an issue with one another, so naturally they took it to the Pope. And this issue was over their growing empires. And what the Pope did was effectively divide the world in two. They drew a line and was like, okay, Portugal, you have everything east of this line. Spain, you have everything west of this line. Play nice. And they listened. Another answer to this question of who were the main players in early modern Europe is the Holy Roman Empire. And they were also important in the Middle Ages because the Holy Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Emperor was the only one powerful enough to defy the Pope. What started as a series of theological debates in church reform in the 11th century snowballed into a Pope versus Emperor conflict that exported to the Holy Land during the Crusades. In the early modern era, the Holy Roman Empire did not have a hereditary succession. Instead, they had an electorate. So a representative here, don't quote me on this, I think there were 7 districts, but essentially an elector, so each district had a vote and they could cast their vote. But what's important here is that anyone could put themselves on this ballot. So Henry VIII put himself on the ballot to be considered for Holy Roman Emperor.
Hold on.
Francis I.
Hold on. The fat ginger man put himself up to be Holy Roman Emperor.
Exactly.
I've never heard this. This is hilarious.
And the person the fat ginger man was beefing with at the time, Francis I, also put himself on this ballot. And obviously, neither of them won. But they were
Are you surprised? Sorry, a little bit more of an academic question here. When he put himself up for this ballot, where was he in the terms of his million wives? Is this when he'd destroyed it with Catherine of Aragon and he was tapping up Anne Boleyn, or was this?
No, this was when he was still lovey-dovey over Catherine of Aragon.
Oh.
At this point in his, yeah. So at that point in his reign, Henry VIII was trying to be part of the cool kids club of continental Europe. So a move to be part of this cool kids club was to put yourself on the ballot to be the Holy Roman Emperor, because that's what the cool kids on continental Europe did.
Okay, another ridiculous question to add to this. I know we're supposed to be talking about colonialism, but now you got me started on this Holy Roman Empire. So we have Francis, we've got King Henry VIII. Was anybody else stupid enough to do this as well?
Those are the two dumbest examples I can think of, but Charles V was on the ballot and he ultimately won.
That so Charles V was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon?
Yes.
Okay, right. I'm on it. Sorry, keep going.
So when Charles V became Holy Roman Emperor, he was only 19. And when his tenure as Holy Roman Emperor started, the expedition to Mexico was only starting to gain traction. When his tenure ended, Spain had conquered large portions of Central and South America. So Charles V had a claim to Spain's empire, in addition to ruling the Holy Roman Empire. And he managed to do so while imprisoning the Pope and stopping Ottoman expansion.
I mean, that's a good way to kind of really consolidate your power there, is not only be the Holy Roman Empire emperor, to also be the emperor, the king of Spain, and shut up the other guy who can probably challenge you, which is the Pope at this time. So,
And Charles V imprisoned the Pope when Henry VIII was trying to get that divorce.
oh God.
So Pope Charles Charles V was like, not so fast. I'm imprisoning him. You can't talk to him. Sorry.
Was that the reason he
And this was
imprisoned
be
him, or was that just because he
no,
could?
no, this was because even though there were these big empires being built, everyone wanted their slice of northern Italy. And in order to get their slice of northern Italy, Charles V was like, okay, I have to imprison the Pope. And he did.
Oh my days, this is becoming very complicated. But I can see where you're coming from with the colonialism. I'm starting to see the door open. But okay, let's keep going with this. So I can, like I said, Charles the First, Charles the Fifth. God, I've got to get my Charleses correct this time round. I do this with all the Henrys, and God knows everybody laughs at me for getting the
There are
wrong
so
numbers.
many Charleses from like so many different countries. It's like you can spin the wheel and that's probably their name.
Exactly. I mean, considering there's Charles the Third now in the UK, so let's add that to the mix. So you can already see his motivation for starting up colonialism, but what about the other states? What are their what are their motivations to start looking at or possibly moving towards colonialism?
While the cause for each expedition cannot be reduced to a single answer, there are a couple common denominators. One being wealth. I mean, it's human nature, people want wealth, and we know that these nations wanted wealth because of the ways in which these expeditions were financed. For instance, Christopher Columbus, he sailed for Spain, but he was from Genoa. And he sailed for Spain, not Genoa, because he had to pitch his expedition the same way people pitch their business to investors today. Columbus pitched to Genoa, and we all know how that went because he didn't end up sailing for Genoa. He ended up pitching to Spain at just the right time in 1492. In January 1492, Spain ended their centuries long Reconquista, so there was a spirit of triumph in the air. So they thought, all right, Columbus has an idea. We can do this Reconquista thing again. We'll support you. So that was one reason that nations started looking into colonialism is they wanted wealth and they were willing to invest in whoever's expedition could bring that wealth. Another reason that is not often discussed but deserves some attention is dealing with unwanted populations. For instance, with France during the Reformation absolutely tore France apart, and France was not keen on having their Huguenot or French Protestant population. So they thought, hey, what a bright idea. Let's deport the Huguenots. And that's exactly what they did. So in 1555, there was a mission to, not necessarily mission, there was a mission to deport the Huguenots to Brazil. Problem is, Portugal was already there. So France was like, all right, we know Portugal's there, but we really need to deport our Huguenots. So they sent an expedition to Brazil. It was doomed. It only lasted 12 years because Portugal kicked them off. It was like, get out of our land, bye bye. And you would think that France would learn do not deport your Huguenot from their failure in France. Nuh-uh. they had another expedition to deport the Huguenots to Florida. So in 1564, there was a French expedition to Florida, or as it's called in French, la Caroline. Problem is, Spain was already there. And Spain was not too keen on having one, Protestants, and two, another nation in their land. So there was a lot of fighting over Florida, and the French were ultimately kicked out.
That's really interesting because when you think of deporting people, obviously, when you look at my field, which is like 500 years later, you realize that, for example, Hitler had the bright idea to deport all the Jews of Europe to Madagascar. And that's what I tend to hyper focus on is the 20th century and deportations at this time. But you don't really think that nations had that idea already in the 1500s to be able to literally take all the Protestants and just deport them all out. I mean, how is that even possible to be able to deport so many people?
Good question. Well, they were desperate because, as I said earlier, the Reformation tore France apart. There were wars over the Protestant population in France, the French Wars of Religion. And what caused, there was one edict that started it all. I forget what it's called, but it was one edict that started it all. And then it was edict after edict after edict until the Edict of Nantes in, I want to say 1598 was the edict of all edicts that was like, okay, the Edict of Nantes caved to the idea of having Huguenot in France, but they're like, okay, Huguenot, you can exist, but you have to follow our calendar, our holidays, and you can only worship in private or something like that.
I just can't imagine having to force deport all of these people. And yeah, it just seems very chaotic to me and just not feasible, if that makes sense. It's a stupid idea, basically, what I'm trying to say in the
It was
latest
frankly
time.
stupid, and not all the Huguenots got deported. The smart ones, they fled. So during Elizabeth's reign, actually, there were a lot of Huguenot refugees in early modern England. And if they didn't flee to England, they fled to the Channel Islands.
Let's move to some more of the tangible symptoms of early modern colonialism. So, what are some of these?
I'd say the commodities that flooded European markets after these expeditions came home. So we want stuff, people in early modern Europe wanted stuff, but the stuff they wanted either couldn't be found in early modern Europe, it couldn't be found in large enough quantities in early modern Europe, or it was incredibly expensive. So when Portugal opens the door to Asia, they found a sea route where the Venetians had previously had a land route, but the land route took a long time. For instance, Marco Polo's journey from Venice to Xanadu was 3 years long, whereas the Portuguese could make that sail in much less than 3 years. And when they came back, they brought back so many spices and later on porcelain. So when all these spices came back to Europe, European consumers could not get enough. Their diets had been bland, and we still want our food to taste good. And early modern Europeans certainly wanted their food to taste good too. And with all these spices being cheaply available, they could not get enough. For instance, pepper and cinnamon were very popular to season their bland diets. But besides spices, precious metals, and gemstones from the Spanish Empire, there was gold and silver in Europe, but it couldn't be found in large enough quantities. And while we typically think of mines as like, okay, whatever, dig a hole in the ground, there's so much more to having a mine, especially in Europe, than just digging a hole in the ground. In the Spanish Empire, for instance, they discovered large repositories of precious metals. In fact, Columbus nearly turned back, but what convinced him to return to Hispaniola was they found gold on the surface. And all of a sudden, you find this gold flooding European markets. It was still expensive, but there was certainly much more gold in the New World than there was in Europe at the time. And also pearls. Pearls probably couldn't be found in Europe, but there was an abundance of the oysters that produced pearls in Spain's Pearl Coast and Portugal's Pearl Coast. So all of a sudden, when these pearls flooded the markets, wealthy Europeans could not get enough of their pearls. They would find them, and if you look at some portraits, they're even having pearls on their dresses, and they have the pearls there in the first place because of colonialism.
I love it. we want your stuff. We can't get enough of your stuff. So literally we will take your stuff to fuel
Exactly,
our
that's what
need.
happened.
Okay, so we've touched on literally consumer demand. Isn't that what the
Hmm.
business people say? Consumer demand.
Yeah.
Let's have a look at societal symptoms. How do they change? I want to say something positive, but I know you're gonna totally depress me now, aren't you?
Yeah, there's nothing really positive when it comes to colonialism.
So
It's flawed at the core.
hit us with these societal symptoms.
Absolutely. So, with proto-capitalism, there was an emerging merchant class. And with colonialism, there was more stuff for these merchants to sell. So they became incredibly wealthy. And that wealth challenged the idea of what being rich could look like. Because before, you needed to have land, income from your lands, and a title to match. And that's what made you conventionally wealthy. So all of a sudden, there's these people who they're wealthy, but they have no land, certainly no income from their land, and no title to match. And yet they were still wealthy because they traded commodities that were found in the New World. And at times, these merchants were even richer than the traditional landed aristocracy because consumer demand, people wanted their stuff. And with luxury goods, they remained expensive, or I should say, some remained expensive while others became everyday items. For instance, sugar. There's sugar in literally everything, but sugar used to be a luxury good. And these merchants, they became wealthy because they were able to produce enough sugar to make it an everyday item and sell it to the consumers who wanted it. So I guess that's another symptom as well, luxury goods becoming everyday items like sugar and spices. And then something we don't often think of is porcelain. As I said earlier, the Venetians for a while had the land routes to the porcelain producing region, say that fast 3 times, of Asia. And since they didn't have the sea routes, they would quite literally have a caravan go to these regions on foot and land and whatever, have a batch of porcelain made, and then bring it back on land. So that's probably at least 5 years round trip. So naturally, porcelain was very expensive. And when the Portuguese came around and opened the land routes, not the land routes, the sea routes to Asia, they brought porcelain back with them. And eventually the Dutch got on board with the porcelain in the 17th century. But that's later on towards the end of the early modern era. But now all of a sudden there was porcelain in households because now it was an everyday item, like porcelain plates, porcelain teacups, tea as well. Tea also flooded markets, and tea became a whole social event. Like we have tea time where like people come over for tea. Tea certainly doesn't grow in Europe. Tea grows in the New World, and they would more specifically Asia. So they grow tea in Asia and then bring it back to Europe. So now there's these like cultures around tea and like social events around tea because it was introduced through colonialism.
I would never have thought it took, for example, you just said 5 years to get porcelain over. 5 years. I can't imagine that if you put yourself an order, you have to wait so long. I mean, we get annoyed if we don't get an Amazon delivery in 24 hours nowadays. Or, for example, even a couple of
Yeah,
years ago, a letter or a postcard. And I can now see why some of these products were, one, in high demand, two, very difficult to get hold of and expensive. And then three, some of these merchants had to be sending hundreds of ships constantly to keep this supply and demand going.
exactly. And there were a lot of shipwrecks along the way, and there was certainly no insurance back in the day. If there was a shipwreck, people could probably take it to court, but literally been studies done on all these shipwrecks and what has been extracted from these shipwrecks over the years because there was that high demand.
Oh my days. Okay, so you've already you started the next question. Let's finish it. And that is, I'm assuming there are written accounts of shipwrecks, but there must also be written accounts of expeditions. let's talk about some of these.
Absolutely. The paper trail of early modern colonialism is so long, and there's just so much buried in the archives that we as historians have yet to tap into. And these written accounts can be divided into, like, generally speaking, three categories. There is the epistolary correspondence, travel literature, and the chronicles. So first with epistolary correspondence, it was essentially the letters written between the empire and the state, people, like just all the letters that circulated. And what these letters tell us is the day-to-day and like the daily problems and hiccups along the way that come with trying to build an empire. So many of these letters have been digitized in recent years. So they're just available online for us to read. And they really do give us that valuable insight into what it was like for an average person in the New World. We also have travel literature, which travel literature as a genre is essentially a genre that describes travel. And with all these people going to the New World, some of them went home and wrote about their travels and had it published. These early modern works of travel literature were bestsellers, and we know that they were bestsellers because they were widely translated. Even though they were bestsellers, the travel writers themselves were one-hit wonders because, again, there's only so much you could write about your time in the New World. A famous one-hit wonder was Jean de Lery. He was a French travel writer who went to France's ill-fated colony in Brazil. And when the colony went downhill, he ran away and lived with the local Tupi Amerindians for a couple months. And when he went home to Europe, he wrote about it. And his readership was absolutely infatuated with one, the Tupi, two, Brazil, and three, the possibility of another human who's non-European and non-Christian. A professor once explained this to me as if we as humans were to go on another planet and find alien life. That's what it felt like for someone like Jean de Lery to encounter a non-white, non-Christian other. And European readers could not get enough of his travel literature. And it was such a bestseller to be translated into Latin because even the rich people wanted to read it too. But not every travel writer was a one-hit wonder. For instance, Bartolomé de las Casas, he wrote about his time in the New World, but he also wrote prolifically on colonialism and how destructive it was. So the third category is the chronicles, and we can't really take any of this at face value, but with the chronicles, we really have to take them with a grain of salt because not every chronicler went to the New World, and no matter if the chronicler went to the New World or not, they had an agenda. They were not publishing for the sake of publishing. More often than not, these chronicles were commissioned mostly by the king or someone who was close to the king, and they had an agenda. And their agenda was to effectively promote empire. The Portuguese Empire had a lot of chronicles, and João de Barros was a Portuguese chronicler from the 16th century, but he did not travel to the New World, and yet somehow managed to reflect retrospectively on it because he was probably surrounded by people who actually traveled and read about it. Another chronicler, Gomez Inés de Zurara, was from the 14th century, not sorry, 14th century, 15th century, 1400s. And we really cannot take we have to take his chronicle with the smallest grain of salt possible because his expeditions were instrumental to what would become the transatlantic slave trade.
Okay, so out of all of these our listeners love a question like this. Out of all of these documents that you come across, because I'm assuming there's, like you just said, there is a wealth within the archives that still hasn't been analysed and discovered and written about. What you personally have come across, which one would be your favourite?
I'd say Jean de Lery's Histoire d'un voyage facile à la terre du Brésil. I read it in Latin and I read it in Middle French. What I liked this one a lot is that Jean de Lery was truly publishing for the sake of publishing. And he didn't, like, again, he was an ego. He didn't have much of an agenda. And if he did, it was probably more on the I'm publishing for the sake of publishing side because he doesn't talk about the settlement. He talks about his time living with the Tupi. And if he had an agenda, it was probably to talk about the non-white, non-Christian others and the way they lived and why it was so fascinating. And the way he writes is so personal, and he really tries to convey that sense of personality. So I really, and also the imagery is just so vivid, and it was just so, it made me curious too. Like I use this narrative in my research too, and it's just so interesting.
Does it transport you back there so you can actually see what he sees?
Absolutely. Like that book is a window into the new world.
I love it. Well, the next question is something that I like to focus on. I like to focus on the average person and the experience from the people rather than looking at something like military history or politics, which I absolutely detest politics. But looking at the average person, and in this context, let's use a farmer, for example. What did everybody know about colonialism? I'm not talking about the high up, kings and the people who were involved in all of this. What did the average person think?
So if they weren't exposed to colonialism to some extent, they probably didn't know of it. They probably knew of it if they read about it in a travel literature or if they were somehow exposed to it. And for the average person, the most common exposure to colonialism would probably be if they read a work of travel literature or if they somehow got the money to purchase an expensive luxury good from the New World, maybe. But for the average person, if they weren't exposed to it, they didn't know of it. And certainly for the farmer was away from the city and they probably only went to market town once or twice a week. So they probably didn't know much of it because they weren't exposed to it. Now, the higher ups in society, absolutely. Like the kings and queens, they were the one perpetrating colonialism. Of course they knew what was going on. Those around them, absolutely. And then there were even colonial offices with their responsibility to know what was going on in the New World and to solve whatever problems were happening in the New World.
You already mentioned this, I think it was a couple of questions ago, about opposition to colonialism, but more within the writings and not, I don't mean there's a direct opposition, but people that didn't quite agree with it. But was there actual opposition? Were there riots or I don't know?
Absolutely.
There were, oh, interesting. Okay, interesting. Tell us about
Each expedition carried a risk of rebellion or mutiny. And we know there was a very famous mutiny in the Magellan expedition. So Ferdinand Magellan was an evil human being, and for a majority of his career, he sailed for Portugal, where he was from. But one day, he got the bright idea to pitch a Western route to Asia. If that sounds familiar, that's what Columbus pitched in 1492 and before. I say "and before" because there's some sources that say Columbus pitched to Henry VII, and of course, that did not go over well. But who did manage to pitch to Henry VII? John Cabot. And back to opposition. So there was opposition to Magellan's expedition from the various people he pitched to because they didn't invest in it. And he somehow managed to convince the Spanish government to pitch his western route to Asia. And ultimately, Magellan did find a western route to Asia, but it took him 2 years to sail there. So, not the best idea. So, the expedition was pitched, and Magellan had no guidance whatsoever. It was like basically a free for all. And the expedition was delayed, and along the way, there was a mutiny. Now, I don't know the full details of this mutiny, but rumor has it that Magellan decapitated the leader of this mutiny to set an example. Yeah, evil human being. And
He sounds like
slowly
someone you
after
want to
that
have for lunch.
yeah,
Sorry,
no.
sorry to interrupt you with that, but you
Oh,
want to
no
have him.
worries.
You want to have him for a cup of tea, don't you? And a sandwich. Jesus.
But after that mutiny, the crew slowly died off because, again, they sailed around the southernmost tip of South America, and that's a very cold part of the world, and they were not prepared for it. And then they finally reached the Philippines 2 years later, and I don't know how many left with Magellan, but there were only 5 besides Magellan who survived. And when they reached the Philippines, they met harsh opposition. There was already a thriving Muslim society in the Philippines. A lot of people don't realize this, but the Philippines was actually predominantly Muslim before colonialism. And there was already a Muslim elite in the Philippines. And when Magellan and his entourage tried to impose Christianity, they were met with opposition because, again, they already had a Muslim society and they were already Muslim. So Magellan responded to that opposition by burning their village. He was like, okay, you're resisting me, I'm resisting you, lit the torch. And of course, they opposed Magellan burning their village and killed him.
Well, too bloody right. He deserved it. Please tell me they
Exactly.
chopped his head off or something.
The the account just says one sentence, they killed him, or he was killed. Some iteration, one sentence, he was killed.
I'm going to imagine that they chopped his head off, paraded around on a stick or something, because he damn well deserves it for being such a bastard.
And after he was killed, the expedition was left clueless. They were like, what the fuck? We don't have anyone to lead us. And the story goes they sailed to the Portuguese Empire and somehow got rescued.
But there was only what, five of them, 4 of them left?
5 of them.
How the heck can you manage a ship with 5 people?
The account says that they somehow picked a governor and left.
I'm gonna have to ask some of my naval people because this is I mean I don't, it's not that I don't believe it, it's just how did they manage it? It must have been a lot of work for 5 people. That's
It was
crazy.
a giant free for all.
My days.
And then, if you think that Spain learned don't colonize the Philippines, they tried again. And in 1542, when the Council of the Indies was established, it revived the idea of a Spanish East Asia, but they didn't act on it until nearly 20 years later, when an expedition sailed from Mexico across the Pacific to reach the Philippines. And let's just say they met even more opposition. And colonizing the Philippines took so long because of that opposition. The climate, too, was not friendly to the Spanish. And the locals, again, they were a Muslim society and they already had their own society. And they were not happy with the idea of someone coming in, taking over, imposing a new religion and a new social order. So the Spanish didn't really establish a permanent settlement in the Philippines until much, much later because of that fierce opposition. And they went to the Philippines because they wanted to get in on the spice trade, but they could only produce cinnamon. So it was all that, encountering all that opposition for what?
Cinnamon.
Cinnamon.
Okay, well, you've given us a really great. I mean, I think it's really interesting. I'd like to talk about this more, but I want to know a little bit more about your research. What are you doing and what are you working on right now?
So my research right now is quite interdisciplinary. It analyzes and interprets Shakespeare's poem, The Rape of Lucrece, as an allegory of early modern colonialism. This research is divided into 3 parts. The first part looks at the poem Spoiling Men, Tarquin, Lucrece's rapist, and Colantine, Lucrece's husband, because in the allegory, Colantine represents the Amerindian sovereign, while Tarquin represents the European conqueror, while Colantine represents the Amerindian sovereign, and therefore the rape of Lucrece is the forced transfer of sovereignty underlying each colonial expedition. Part 2 looks at Lucrece herself and how she represents the New World and its peoples. Therefore, the rape of Lucrece is her destruction and the destruction of the New World. And part 3 is a synthesis of part 1 and part 2 that analyzes and interprets the poem as a commentary on early modern colonialism. My research wasn't always this interdisciplinary. My first big research project looked at landed class women in the colonial era and how they occupied and asserted positions of authority on plantations. Because again, another societal symptom of early modern colonialism was the spirit of resentment, because no one wanted to be in the New World, and especially the Caribbean. We think of the Caribbean now as this idyllic vacation spot, but a couple hundred years ago, that was not the case. And having traveled to the Caribbean for research, I can certainly attest to that. It was hot, it was really disgusting, and everything was so far apart and yet so compact, because the distance from house to house was far, especially on foot because there were no cars. And yet within that house, everything was so compact and close together. And because of that spirit of resentment, there was either one, less incentive to reproduce the hierarchy, or two, even more incentive to fight to preserve the hierarchy. And despite this, landed class women still managed to occupy and assert positions of authority on plantations. And then with that project, I was like, okay, I guess the 17th century is my first love. I will always love the 17th century, but the 18th century is not for me. I do not want to see 177 in my documents. And I'm like, no, thank you. And then
Sorry. I get that feeling sometimes with certain periods of history. So yeah.
And then now I'm actually coming off a case study on violence as a mechanism of governance in the early modern Spanish and Portuguese empires, because in working on landed class women, I was like, okay, I loved looking at the more early modern side into why these hierarchies existed, but I was not a fan of the 18th century. So I looked at a lot of opposition to colonialism because that was met with violence. And a lot of the ways in which they justified colonialism, which to me as a modern, I can look back and be like, oh my God, what were you thinking? But in the early modern era, that was the cat's meow. Like they were totally on board with these crazy justifications. Like these justifications were insane. And I unfortunately couldn't cover all of them in a 10,000 word limit, but they used Aristotle, they used Thomas Aquinas, they used whatever they can to justify having an empire, and it was absolutely insane.
Okay, really stupid question. How the heck do they use Aristotle to justify this?
So they manipulated one of his right, like part of his work to justify slavery and colonialism.
That is so stupid. Sorry. That's just
Exactly. And as I was reading this, I was like, oh my goodness, you've got to be so fucking stupid. Like, what are you doing? A surprising justification was Thomas Aquinas and Summa Theologica. They somehow manipulated Thomas Aquinas to their own ends to support their growing empire.
I guess you can do that with a lot of different texts and like people like you and I who don't need to manipulate these texts, who don't need to manipulate these texts, we would never think of using them. But there are other people who have a certain agenda and they will take a text. I mean, a text that you and I could never ever think of in the sense of it's written as it is, but to them, it's
Exactly.
manipulated to their
And the
agenda.
thing and the thing is, a lot of these kings who tried to make colonialism look like a good idea, they had access to lawyers, they had access to theologians, and they could effectively manipulate these lawyers and theologians into making these theological doctrines or whatever legal doctrines work to justify colonialism.
I mean, we're kind of talking about this now in a way, and that's I can't even say the word historicist histo historicist Jesus historicist theories. How do they help us understand writers in colonial society?
So before I answer this question, I have to briefly define New Historicist theory. So New Historicist theory is a framework to literary studies that analyzes and interprets a work of literature as a product of its time. For instance, with my research, I use New Historicist theory to analyze and interpret the Rape of Lucrezia as an allegory of early modern colonialism. That isn't the only theory I use, but it is one of them I use. And for us historians, New Historicist theory can best be described as when literary scholars try to do history and fail. Because scholars have been trying to kill New Historicist theory for decades, and it somehow comes back more resilient than ever. And this is because when literary scholars do history, they often end up speculating because they're not trained in historiography, they're trained to analyze the world around them. So while historiography is a way to analyze the past and to an extent the world around a particular author, it doesn't work the same way literary analysis works. So using literary analysis to analyze the past doesn't work. And New Historicist theory has led literary scholars to take that approach. And with each iteration of New Historicist theory trying to be killed, you can take a look at the scholarship and see more literary scholars try to incorporate historiography. So one instance, it was just merely referring to historical texts. And then another instance, after they tried killing it one time, is starting to quote from these texts, but not integrating it right. So literary scholars who do new historicism who are not trained in historiography, they'll analyze a work of literature, quote something, but not properly integrate that quote into their literary scholarship. It just ends up being really awkward. And if they're quoting a historical document and analyzing it like a work of literature, or just in a way that it's not supposed to be analyzed, it is really awkward.
Sounded like a mouthful.
Yeah, it is quite a mouthful.
I'd like to say I've got a couple of friends who are they're classed I can't even say the word now. Philologists. Yeah, I'm gonna leave it as a philologist because that's as far as I can go. And you can instantly see the way between what they analyze and the way I analyze are two completely different ways. And it's really interesting to see how they do it and the perception, but they also sometimes make me think. I mean, I'm talking about this from a modern perspective rather
Of course.
than looking at medieval history or early modern. And sometimes they do make me think, and I go, oh, well, that's kind of an interesting way to look at it. And it gives me other ideas. So kind of my point is being able to look at interdisciplinary ideas where they help me and I help them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, with historians and literary scholars, they don't often get along. And it was actually with early modern studies where New Historicism was born. Because a lot of literary scholars were like, okay, we should kind of sort of start taking authors out of their vacuum and putting them in a context. Because when literary scholars analyze the work of literature, they often analyze the work of literature in a vacuum and not in their context. New historicist theory does help literary scholars analyze the work in their context and not just a vacuum. But again, it has to be done right. And when present, and let's just say with my research, The Rape of Lucrezia, I do use the poem at hand, but I also integrate travel literature in a way that works. Whereas for some who would, and I don't know, this happens a lot with early modern drama, where they would analyze early modern drama, but like put in a source that doesn't work as well.
So we're coming to an end slowly but surely. I know some of our listeners are probably saying boo and that we have to get you back because I've actually really enjoyed this. So thank you. But we've we've talked about what's been written, but there's also a lot written about later colonialism.
Absolutely.
How do we take early modern and medieval colonialism now?
So, two words come to mind, and that is race and slavery. I've probably said this in the podcast at some point, but late medieval and early modern Europe was an incredibly hierarchical society, and there always has been and always will be some metric to measure difference. Before contact with the non-white, non-Christian other, that difference, or I should say that metric to measure difference, is religion. Now, that's a bit of a hot topic, but religion does measure difference at its core. Class, heritage, and there's so many more. But now that the white Christian European has encountered the non-white, non-Christian other, there's another hierarchy and another metric to measure difference. And that hierarchy relied on the subjugation of these non-white, non-Christian others. And as early as the mid 15th century, we already see a racialized hierarchy in the early modern Portuguese Empire, with the white Portuguese at the top, the Moor or the Muslim from North Africa somehow in the middle, but not quite at the bottom, and the Blackamoor from sub-Saharan Africa. And the two groups on the bottom, then they were both non-white and they both ended up enslaved. So another word, slavery. The Portuguese Empire was probably the one who kickstarted the early modern, the transatlantic slave trade, even though Spain was tapping in too. And slavery, again, the Portuguese king at the time somehow managed to manipulate the Pope into thinking that slavery was justifiable. And if you read the document that justified slavery, they use every other word besides slave. I think if I remember correctly, they say so I'm paraphrasing here, and the document says the Portuguese king and his successors have the right to subdue and subjugate all Saracens, infidels, or other enemies of Christ. That was from the Pope. And that phrase single-handedly justified slavery. And what did they do with slavery? They built their empire.
I want to say something nice about the Pope, but if you look at the Pope in the 20th century, that's also a shitstorm. So approving
Oh my
slavery
goodness.
and approving the Holocaust are they go hand by hand. Like, it's just ridiculous.
We as moderns think of the Pope as an old man driving around in the Pope mobile, waving at everybody. But if you take a look at popes over time, they were not the friendly little old men we think of them as.
That's John Paul II. Every time we always think of the Pope, it's John Paul II and his little, because that's where the Pope Mobile came from after there was an attempted assassination of him, and he started driving around in this little mobile. And that is, I mean, that's serious. You're right. That is how we think of the Pope, but they weren't always little old men. They were tyrants in a way, and people that approved of literal genocide.
Yes, the Pope in the Middle Ages was certainly a tyrant because, again, under feudalism, kings answered to the Pope. They didn't answer to their own people, they answered to the Pope. And in the early modern era, when feudalism became phased out, their Pope was still somehow above them, but they had to answer to their subjects as well. So the Pope was still that tyrant. For instance, Pope Julius II, people thought that he was named or he named himself after Pope Julius I, but sources say he actually named himself after Julius Caesar. And it just so happened to be that there was a pope before him named Julius.
How many people model themselves after Julius Caesar? It's ridiculous. I think one day we need
It's
to make a
insane.
podcast. We have to make a podcast. How many people model themselves out of Julius Caesar and everybody argues who's the stupidest one?
I think Pope Julius II probably takes the cake.
Oh, I don't know. I could have some contenders, but I'm not going to start mentioning 20th century history and idiocy from that time period. But Catherine, listen, it has been absolutely great having you on. And I think this has been very eye-opening because when you think of early modern Europe, you don't actually think of colonialism, you don't think of slavery, and you don't think of people literally taking things that do not belong to them. So it's been great having you on. You've got to come back and do some more because I think we could talk
Oh
about
my
this forever.
goodness, absolutely. I would love to come back.
Amazing. Listen, when is your book going to come out about this?
Oh my goodness, I don't know. I'm still only in the proposal stages, and I only just got funding to start writing.
Okay, so we're going to wait for your book and we're going to wait for you to come back on the podcast. So, yes, you're welcome anytime. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Don't forget, even though Catherine doesn't have a book with us, you can still go to bookshop.org and grab any of our previous speakers' books from our bookstore. You don't send money to the Rainforest website, and we also make a little bit of money, and money goes to our speakers. Don't forget to leave us a 5-star review on Apple. We all love a shiny review. Remember our website, www.historyhack.co.uk, and also remember you can buy us a drink on Ko-fi, a one-off donation, ko-fi.com/historyhack. And if you really like us, subscribe to our Patreon, www.patreon.com/historyhack. Chris will give you a nice message. I'm still waiting for one of these to come through. I'm too excited about that. And I'm going to sign off for you guys with my usual dad joke. And this one's I think it's quite me, because I found a book, How to Solve 50% of Your Problems. So I bought two. Thanks very much, guys. See you next time.